Okay, so for my final project, I decided to research Taiwan and Japan, which Taiwan has actually been handling this pandemic very effectively. As of May 11th, 2020, there have been only 440 cases and 7 deaths. When the first cases started to appear in China, Taiwan shut it down December 31st of 2019. They started to screen every single passenger coming in from Wuhan, China. And Taiwan actually saw this as kind of an opportunity to prove their autonomy and that they were able to be independent from China. In addition to this kind of motivating them to really take hold of the situation in Taiwan, in 2003 when the SARS outbreak occurred, it was handled pretty similarly to how the COVID-19 pandemic is being handled today, and therefore Taiwan kind of knows the proper roles to be set in place and the equipment that's needed. However, Taiwan has actually been unable to speak at or even attend the World Health Assembly, but this is because their current president, Tsai Ing-wen, is not considered to be China-friendly. This is because technically China still claims Taiwan under its One China principle. Another reason why Taiwan is doing or handling this pandemic so well is because of its soft power. In different regions of Taiwan, there's systems set up to make sure that everyone's, if they're out of work, they're being paid, that everyone's fed, that people aren't dying. Taiwan was originally annexed by the Qing dynasty in 1683, and it was ceded to Japan in a treaty that helped end the Sino-Japanese War. Taiwan was governed in Japan until 1945, when it was surrendered to the Republic of China. However, after losing the Civil War after governing China for several decades, the ROC fled to Taiwan but still held the belief that there was one China. The KMT, or the Chinese Nationalist Party, governed Taiwan from about 1949 to 1987 under martial law. From this began a long streak of discrimination from Chinese people against Taiwanese people. For example, Australia and China have a comprehensive strategic partnership, and this has brought many Chinese and Taiwanese migrants. So many migrants living in Australia have faced as well their fair share of discrimination. An example of this is from an Australian woman from Taiwan named Jade Lau, and she worked at a shoe store where she was berated by a customer who was a Chinese student. And this was brought on simply because the customer asked Jade whether or not she thought Taiwan was a part of China. Many situations like this, even today, have cost Taiwanese people their jobs and their reputations. In the earlier days of this pandemic, in March more specifically, Japan thought that they had this whole thing under control. Like many countries, they shut down schools and large gatherings, but people were still working, businesses were still open, and few people decided to work from home. However, there was a few number of cases, and this led to a lot of suspicion because there was a low testing rate and people were still working. With a population of 126.5 million, around only 200,000 people have been tested. Even when they saw their first case in January, hospitals began turning away patients. Japanese government claimed that widespread testing was a waste of resources. Not to mention that testing is governed by local health centers that aren't equipped to see a lot of people, pulling up. In early April, however, a national state of emergency was put in place by Prime Minister Abe, which was a pretty tough decision to make, seeing that Japan is already struggling economically due to the postponement of the 2020 Olympics. Along with low testing rates, there's another whittle problem Japan's law won't really allow for a full lockdown, whereas other places are able to detain and confine people from breaking lockdown rules. Japan just has to hope that people follow the rules. Speaking of Japanese law, let's talk about that. Japan's legal system was created during the Meiji Restoration, and after World War II, it was changed and infused with a lot of American influence, and they put an emphasis on personal freedom. Therefore, why lockdown won't technically work, because technically it's violating people's freedom. Going back to the very beginning, there was very little of a structured law system in Japan as a whole. However, there were smaller clans, and a lot of the law was influenced by Confucianism and Buddhism. And there was technically still a unified Japanese society. Also, because of Japan's past wartime, they're a little fearful of widespread and deep-rooted power. Alright, so now we're going to be talking about America, and what better place to talk about it than the McDonald's parking lot. With most modern global problems, America has pretty much been left out of the conflict. Even with Pearl Harbor and 9/11, we sent our military overseas rather than dealing with it here. When the first cases of COVID-19 were documented, instead of trying to prepare and get the proper equipment we need, our first priority was rather to keep the disease out of the country, and we created travel bans. However, in the early days of the virus, over here we really didn't think it was something that needed to be taken seriously. Even in the past, with natural disasters affecting only certain portions of the country, we really haven't been prepared to take care of those either. But even with this in mind, we do know that governments can never be fully prepared to take on something like this. But we have used what we've learned in the past to help us today. For example, in 2005, George W. Bush prompted his Homeland Security provider to create a national pandemic strategy after reading The Great Influenza, which is a book about the flu pandemic of 1918. But we have used what we've learned in the past to help us today. For example, in 2005, George W. Bush prompted his Homeland Security provider to create a national pandemic strategy after reading The Great Influenza, which is a book about the flu pandemic of 1918. Even then, cabinet officials were hesitant, saying that there were more urgent problems to deal with. In 2018, the Global Health Security and Biodefense Unit, which was responsible for pandemic preparedness and established in 2015, was disbanded under the assumption that it wasn't a top priority. America is handling this pandemic by putting lockdowns and quarantines in place. Non-essential businesses are closed, many people are working from home or unemployed, which is causing a great economic problem. However, one problem with this is it just really isn't in America's culture to be stuck inside for a long period of time, especially during summer months. I mean, even now, being about 2 months into quarantine, protests are taking place. I don't know how that would be effective. Anyways, I mean, it's seared into the minds of people from places such as Taiwan and Japan and China that when something like this happens, a quarantine or a lockdown or just avoiding large groups altogether will help to lessen the effect of this. However, America has never really had to know what quarantine or lockdown is like, so a lot of people just think it's pointless. America has had the privilege, and most people living now have never had to deal with anything like this.